Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Strength and Hormones podcast. Today is a Lowdown with Lo episode, and we are going to be diving into one of my absolute favorite topics, and that is the interconnection between inflammation and hormone imbalances. And really unpacking today, could inflammation be driving your hormone imbalance, particularly as it relates to polycystic ovary syndrome, PCOS, insulin resistance, or type 2 diabetes, and hypothyroidism or Hashimoto's. Those are really the main hormone conditions that we're going to cover, but understand that inflammation really spans far and wide and how it affects our hormones. And we're going to talk about why that is today. I absolutely am so passionate about this subject because I truly believe that it's such an underlooked aspect of what's really causing hormone imbalance. Everyone talks about cycle syncing and minerals and exercise and all these things for hormones. And while those are great, and don't get me wrong, that there is some premise behind how those support our hormones, at the core of these stubborn hormone issues really is inflammation. And it's the root cause of so many hormone imbalances, both in women and in men. And we're going to get into why that is and how it doesn't just stop at hormones. It really penetrates the body so much deeper. But hormones are that messenger, they're that chemical messenger that we see these symptoms show up in and that we see us most affected by. So let's just first and foremost start off by talking about what is inflammation. Now, inflammation gets a really bad rap as being the total bad guy, but it's not. Acute inflammation, which is the inflammation that happens when, say, you cut yourself or you roll your ankle and blood and heat and swelling goes to that site of injury, is really a way of restoring homeostasis, restoring balance, and providing healing in the body. And it really just means that there's an imbalance of where healing resources are being diverted. So all that blood is being diverted to that one area to be able to help facilitate healing for however long that takes. Generally, it's a short period of time, and then the body recovers, and you aren't having issues with swelling and such for many, many days or weeks after that initial injury. Chronic inflammation, however, is very different in that it's this sneaky low grade level of inflammation that sometimes gets depicted in blood testing. And we can see this show up in things like our C reactive protein or CRP levels. Other times it doesn't. And this occurs when the body starts sending out these inflammatory cells and substances, just as what would happen with your ankle roll or a cut on your leg. The body starts sending out these signals, but it doesn't stop sending them out, and there's no infection or injury happening. But these inflammatory cells and substances are still being sent to all these different areas within the body. And this can manifest in several different ways. Most commonly for women that this manifests with hormone imbalances, this shows up as symptoms like brain fog, difficulty with concentration, remembering things, low mood. So this could be depression, anxiety, or just a low mood state. Premenstrual dysmorphic disorder is another one. Difficulty losing weight. You feel like you are doing all the things with an exercise and diet, but your body is just holding on to weight, or maybe you're even having a lot of like water retention and puffiness. Daily fatigue, especially with energy crashes, feeling like you're waking up feeling okay, but then really crashing as you get into the middle of the day. Bloating issues and feeling like no matter what you eat, you're so bloated, so uncomfortable. And then PMS symptoms, which can include a lot of these already mentioned symptoms, as well as things like cramping, headaches, these other general inflammatory symptoms. So those are just some of the common ones as it relates to hormones. But for others, this could be things like joint pain. It could be hair loss. There's so many other ways that this can manifest in the body, but those are the most common that we see. We also know that there's some hormonal situations that actually already create a chronic inflammatory state. So, for example, oral contraceptives, we know because they create a low hormone state, create an inflammatory state. Hormones are actually very anti-inflammatory, especially when they're in the right balance of one another. So especially like estrogen, for example, is an extremely anti-inflammatory hormone. And that's one of the reasons why when women first have a baby, why you deal with a lot of the postpartum blues right away. It's the same reason why women that go through menopause also deal with these symptoms, because there's a loss of estrogen that happens. But the same thing happens when you're on a oral contraceptive, because it's shutting off the amount of that estrogen that's being made. We also also know that just menopause in general is considered a pro-inflammatory state. You can find this if you do any research on menopause, that it's generally defined as just a low-grade level of inflammation is going on in the body. So autoimmunity, right? If you have Hashimoto's, that also with autoimmunity, there's a low-level grade of inflammation. And we're going to talk about all the reasons as to why this is. Just because these things are correlated with inflammation doesn't mean you're doomed to be inflamed forever, but you are already at a higher level of this chronic inflammation. And there's things that we want to do to address that so that you can start feeling your best again, because it's often and common that women that are in those brackets are dealing with a lot of these symptoms. I forgot to mention acne being another potential inflammatory symptom that some people experience too. So I've really reduced things down to three things that cause inflammation. And inflammation can mean a lot of things. It's an umbrella term. So I think it's important for us to really define, how is this inflammation showing up? First and foremost, the gut. And it's eating foods that are irritating the gut. It's foods and environmental factors that are creating what we call a leaky gut or intestinal permeability. And we're going to talk about that here in a minute. The gut is a huge place of cytokine release. Our gut houses about 70% of our immune system. So the gut is a huge role in our systemic inflammatory levels within the body. The second is something called mitochondrial dysfunction. Ooh, we're going to talk about that today because it really matters when it comes to inflammation and really so many things. But our mitochondria are actually where sex hormones start. So if you want to improve your sex hormone levels, you've got to be thinking about the mitochondria, because that's literally where pregnenolone, it's where cholesterol is converted into sex hormones, and where pregnenolone is made, which is our master hormone in the body. And we have trillions of mitochondria, or we should have trillions of mitochondria in the body. Their job is to generate energy from the food that we eat. So if you've ever thought about what happens after I eat all this lovely food, that's your mitochondria that are that middleman there. And then the third thing is blood sugar dysregulation. And we're going to get into the highs and lows of that and how they both affect our chronic inflammation levels. So let's first start off by talking about the gut and inflammation. So research actually indicates that the modification of the microbiota, so the bacteria that are in your gut, in various different disease states, can all reduce inflammation and improve your metabolic profile. So what that means is that if we modify your microbiome, if we influence, we positively improve your bacteria in your gut, that it can significantly have an impact on reducing inflammation, improving the metabolic profile in so many different types of diseases. And if you have ever heard before, there's something that's called like a fecal transplant, which is utilized a lot in irritable bowel disease, where there's a chronic inflammatory state in the gut, and they actually take the feces of someone and they essentially transplant it into another individual, and it completely shifts the microbiome of that person and completely transforms their life. I mean, there's so many accounts of fecal transplants having such a powerful impact on helping really cure IBD. So that's just one example of how this works. But the reason why these bacteria matter is because these bacteria, we have good and bad bacteria in our gut. And when there's a dysbiosis, so an imbalance of the good and bad, there's too many bad, not enough good potentially, which happens in a lot of people. And it's because of the food we're eating, it's our environment, it's the way we were raised, the soil we were raised on, the way we were birthed. It was our breast milk versus our bottle. It was all these things that influence this, right? But these influence our intestinal barrier. And your intestinal barrier is what is needed to separate your external environment in your intestines from the interior of your body. So it literally is like this shield, is how I think of it. I think of it as like a gatekeeper that keeps the food that we eat in the right places so that it doesn't get into the bloodstream and create this inflammatory response. And this is why so many people deal with food sensitivities when they have what's called leaky gut, or there's intestinal barrier issues going on. And this is all regulated by these things called intercellular junctions. And there are these tight junctions that regulate this process. And we know that when these tight junctions aren't functioning optimally, that it leads to increased permeability, so increased leaky gut. And this increases the transport of inflammation through what are called inflammatory mediators. Essentially, think of them as like little like traffic controllers that are regulating inflammation within the gut. And this is what then leads to chronic intestinal inflammation. So, leaky gut is a big deal. You've probably heard of it before. You probably know that it's a big deal, but it is really an important piece. And so many people are dealing with this. Why are they dealing with it? We know that stress causes a leaky gut. We know that gluten can increase zonulin that causes leaky gut. We know that glyphosate, which is one of the most common herbicides that's used, especially in the US, Roundup, causes leaky gut. Antibiotics can trigger leaky gut. So there's a lot of different variables that can cause this to happen. We also know that intense exercise in the heat, marathon runners, that leaky gut is also what happens after exercise too. So sometimes it's even things we think we're doing are good, but maybe they're just too stressful on the gut, and that's what causes this situation to happen. Okay, so that's the role of the gut and the inflammation. And sometimes we find too that people don't have any symptoms, but as it relates to autoimmunity, we know that there's three things that trigger an autoimmune disease. You have to have the genetic predisposition. There has to be a stressful life event. That can be something really stressful that happened. It can be pregnancy. It can be menopause. It could be a virus, and it could be a shot. It could also, and then the third thing is a leaky gut. So what we can't control is our genetics. We can only control so much of those other factors like getting a virus and menopause, right? But what we can control is the health of our gut microbiome and supporting prevention of a leaky gut to be able to prevent autoimmunity and help to be able to support our autoimmunity control, essentially, so that we can have a better grasp on supporting autoimmunity within our body. Because once you have one autoimmune condition, like I said, it leads to chronic inflammation, but then it also opens up the door to more autoimmune conditions developing. So moving over to mitochondrial dysfunction, as I mentioned, you've got trillions of mitochondria in the body, and we know that there's a lot of things that can damage or cause mitochondrial dysfunction. One of those is just age. Getting older causes mitochondrial dysfunction. We also know that there's toxins in the environment, things like heavy metals and mold and all of these different chemicals, endocrine disruptors we're exposed to. That's one of the big problems, is that they cause dysfunction within your mitochondria. Um, there can also be issues from stress that can also lead to this too. And remember that stress, when I say that word, it's not just psychological stress, it's all of these factors that lead to stress in the body. But so this is, mitochondria are really important because glucose, so carbohydrate, and fat metabolism, so our ability to metabolize those two very important macronutrients, are largely dependent on your mitochondria to generate energy in your cells. So if our mitochondria aren't functioning properly, then how can we expect to convert that food we're eating into usable energy that's going to actually fuel our cells? Think of your cells as like the car that's driving you, right? Those cells are what control all processes within the body. And when this process isn't happening efficiently, then the ratio of how much energy and how much oxygen is getting consumed is low, it's inadequate. And this leads to an increased production of what we call reactive oxygen species, ROS. And this leads to this ROS essentially cause oxidative stress. So I always think of oxidative stress, I like to explain it as like the rust on the body. Oxidative stress essentially is interchangeable with the word inflammation. Oxidative stress causes inflammation directly. So we can think of it more simply when I say that as when you can't take the foods that we're eating and metabolize them efficiently for cellular energy, then you are leading to inflammation in the body. And we know that reactive oxygen species, that oxidative stress, aka inflammation, that they have extremely maladaptive consequences, and that they stimulate a ton of inflammatory processes in the body. And they're correlated with almost every chronic disease. You name it: diabetes, cancer, Alzheimer's, the list goes on. But as it relates to hormones, this is an area I think is less talked about. At least I don't see it talked about as much. And that's what we're going to get into today. So, how does mitochondrial dysfunction lead into hormones? Well, you may or may not know that it's actually a very well established leading cause of common hormonal conditions. There's been several studies that have shown a very tight bond, a very tight correlation between this elevated level of oxidative stress and PCOS development. That the elevation in these reactive oxygen species causes certain genes to turn on, that then leads to PCOS, and that it also leads to other associated conditions that might look really similar to PCOS, like hyperandrogenism, which means that women that have high levels of male-like hormones, testosterone, DHEA, androstenedione, so on and so forth, that are causing things like irregular cycles, infertility, weight gain, acne, you name it, as well as things like metabolic syndrome. So this is really important to understand, is that it's, people always talk about how these things like metabolic syndrome and PCOS, they're just a consequence of what you're eating, which is such a oversimplification of what actually causes these. Yes, what we eat matters, but it's not just X equals Y, right? It's how the food you're impacting is actually reshaping your mitochondrial function, that's then actually turning on and off genes that are then causing these hormonal conditions to happen. And they've also shown in research that women that have PCOS, they have an imbalance in their Th1 to Th2 cells, our Th1, Th2 immune system. And we talked about this a little bit in my podcast episode where we talked about parasites a couple of weeks ago. So if you're curious to learn more about this, go back and listen to that episode, because we talked about this Th1, Th2 immune system and the implication of parasites, which and the gut and things of that sort, because this all leads into regulating immune function, parasites and bacteria in the gut and such. But in PCOS, they've also shown that there is essentially a dysregulation in this immune function, and that this actually can be what causes the abdominal obesity that happens in women with PCOS. So it's very important for us to understand that inflammation and the immune system have a very important role in PCOS management. Now, in addition to that, about 70% of women with PCOS are insulin resistant, and insulin resistance drives a large chunk of the level of those androgens that are made, things like testosterone, that cause the infertility and the irregular cycles and such. And there's quite a bit of things that go into the mitochondrial function and blood sugar dysregulation piece as well, because when your blood sugar spikes, your immune system jumps into action, and this causes your immune system to go into overdrive, really. And these inflammatory molecules, these are things like the cytokines, as well as things like white blood cells that are part of your immune function. They go into action to help us actually break down that glucose so that it's not going to have the harmful effects that this high level of glucose in the bloodstream is going to potentially create. But on the flip side of that, as I mentioned earlier, it's not just high blood sugar that causes inflammation. Also, when your blood sugar is low, cortisol is released, and cortisol is one of our stress hormones. And in the short term, cortisol actually suppresses inflammation because it actually boosts our immune function. It makes our immune system work better, and this helps to be able to suppress the inflammatory response. However, it's when we have this chronically elevated level of cortisol, which is what we see in most people, that the body really can't take care of this immune function anymore. And this leads to inflammation and leads to a weakened immune system. So when this continues to go on, this perpetuates something that's called insulin resistance. So this is connecting back to what I was just talking about, PCOS. And insulin resistance essentially means that your cells and tissues throughout the body that generally should be able to take that sugar and bring them in are not responding to insulin anymore. So they're resistant to the effects of insulin. What should happen is when you eat, that insulin gets pumped out to be able to take that sugar and literally, like a car, traffic it into the cells and tissues. And when we're insulin resistant, that trafficking isn't happening. It's like you're sitting in traffic, right? The cars aren't moving. And that's what we call insulin resistance. And that's why blood sugar elevates, because blood sugar isn't actually getting out of the blood. It's sitting there. It's not getting into the cells and tissues like it should. And this can then lead to a lot of chronic inflammation, because when that blood sugar is chronically high, that causes inflammation levels to increase. And there's research to show that interventions that improve insulin, or interventions that improve mitochondrial function, also improve insulin resistance. So a lot of people talk about how if you want to improve your insulin resistance, you have to improve your blood sugar control. And while this is an important piece to improving your insulin resistance, it's not the whole picture. It's not even close to it, because just because you lower, think of it like this, think of it like cars, right? Blood sugar is the packages that go into the car. If you just reduce the amount of packages that have to be loaded into the car, sure, maybe the car can drive faster because there's not as many packages to transport. But if the car gets stuck in traffic and it can't get to where the packages need to get delivered, then it really does you no good to have reduced the amount of packages that were in the car. That's essentially what we're talking about with blood sugar, is that the blood sugar is the packages, and the car being able to get to the place to transport the packages is insulin. Okay. So we have to improve mitochondrial function to be able to improve insulin resistance. And they've shown that mitochondrial dysfunction may even be a central cause of insulin resistance and all the associated complications. So going back to the fact that if we want to improve insulin resistance, yes, we need to improve blood sugar, but furthermore, we need to improve mitochondrial dysfunction. And mitochondrial dysfunction is what drives inflammation. And how do we improve mitochondrial dysfunction? That is exactly what we teach you inside of our program, Inflammation Hormony. We teach you the exact steps of things that you need to be cognizant of removing, that you might not be aware of, that are disrupting your mitochondrial function. We teach you exactly what to add to be able to restore mitochondrial function, how to get that energy from the food you're eating to actually make its way into energy so that you can actually feel energized and have less brain fog and start to lose weight if that's a goal of yours, and start to manage your hormone condition better. And we also teach you how to improve your blood sugar regulation, because that is an important piece to this, but it has to be done at the same time that we're also improving your gut inflammation and strengthening that gut barrier so that we don't have leaky gut anymore. And at the same time that we're also improving your mitochondrial function. So it's all three. It's a three-pronged approach to really being able to address that inflammation. Now, kind of finishing up with our last hormone piece of this, I mentioned earlier how mitochondrial dysfunction also impacts things like hypothyroidism and Hashimoto's. And there's research that has showed that inflammation and oxidative stress, remember that they're interchangeable, can actually lead to hormone disorders like hypothyroidism because of the imbalance of what are called peroxidants and antioxidant defenses in the body. So when you make thyroid hormones in the thyroid gland, there is a lot of free radicals that are made. There's a lot of inflammation that happens in that process. Iodine is what's utilized. It's a mineral that's utilized to make those hormones. And if our body doesn't have enough antioxidants in the thyroid and in the body, then that process that of us making those thyroid hormones can be extremely imbalanced. And that's what can lead to this inflammation that can then cause that destruction and the essentially slowdown of our ability to make and convert thyroid hormones. And they've shown that women that have hypothyroidism don't have enough antioxidants. The women that have hypothyroidism have a lower level of antioxidants than they do to peroxidants, which essentially means that you are creating more inflammation in making thyroid hormones than the ability to put that inflammation out. So antioxidants are exactly what their name implies. They're anti-oxidative stress. They literally are like the fire extinguisher on the fire, which is oxidative stress. Okay. And so with women that have hypothyroidism, that there's no fire extinguisher to put out that inflammation. And so what we need to do is nutritionally is we need to change that profile. We need to get your fire extinguisher working more powerfully than the inflammation that's being generated to make those thyroid hormones, so that we can actually get on top of this and we can get the body actually working better for us, and we can get the thyroid out of this extremely inflamed state that happens when thyroid function is low. On the other end of the spectrum with Hashimoto's, it's a little bit different, but still similar. And that in that process of making thyroid hormones, there's something that's called TPO that really helps with that process. And with hypothyroidism, Hashimoto's, there's antibodies to TPO. So that process of being able to convert those really make thyroid hormones out of iodine is essentially getting like X. It's getting canceled out. So it's a very similar way that we can support Hashimoto's is by addressing this inflammation as well, because similarly there's a lot of like attack and inflammation and this like defense situation that's happening in the thyroid with Hashimoto's. So this gives you just an overview of how inflammation could be brewing and could be an underlying cause of your hormonal imbalance. I would say that I don't very often see women who don't have inflammation at the root cause of their hormones. And the reason why I created Inflammation Hormony was because I truly believe it's the first step. If you want to really address your hormones, this has to be addressed first and foremost. Once we've addressed the inflammation and we've improved your leaky gut, we've gotten your mitochondria functioning better, and we've improved your blood sugar regulation, remember both highs and lows, then your body's in a better position to be able to start to improve hormone function. And then once we've done that, now we can start to optimize hormones. Now we can start to address minerals and cycle syncing and all of these other things that, yes, are important for our hormones, but really aren't going to move the needle until the inflammation has been addressed prior. So that is why I created Inflammation Harmony, was as a starting place for you to be able to take that first step. And for some women that we've had go through this program, they haven't even needed any hormonal support afterwards because their hormones came back into alignment. Everything started to realign on its own. Other women need more support after to be able to regulate hormonal function. And that's why we have a part 2 to Inflammation Harmony in case you do need that additional support after those first 5 weeks. But we want you to start with those first 5 weeks so that you can see the powerful effect that resolving inflammation can have on your hormonal function. We've seen everything from women who are dealing with infertility for years get pregnant after our 5 weeks together. We've seen women that have been dealing with chronic fatigue for several years feel like the lights have finally turned on and no longer dealing with energy crashes and being able to take on new projects and responsibilities they never thought that they could before. We've seen women that are dealing with daily depression and battles of low mood feel like their world just completely, this black cloud got lifted, and that they finally feel like their mood is in better regulation. And then we've seen women that have been struggling with hormonal weight loss resistance, that have just been stuck in a place where they cannot lose weight, be able to lose 15, 20 pounds in our 5 weeks together. It's like the weight just comes off so easily. All the swelling comes off because their body no longer is fighting this inflammation that's holding them back from their ability to convert that food that they're eating, this great food they've been eating for so long, into energy. You can eat all the great stuff in the world, but if your gut and your cells aren't responsive to all of those nutrients you're eating, it does you no good. So that's what we teach you in Inflammation Harmony. And we are going to be having doors opening up so soon. We are going to be starting our spring program of things in just a couple of weeks. So we are going to be putting a link for you to be able to join the waitlist so that you'll be the first to know. We're only going to be letting in, or I guess we'll only have 100 spots open for women to join. We already have 200 women on the wait list as the time that this episode goes live, which is early March, or sorry, the time of this episode being recorded, which is early March. So if you are interested in this program, definitely be sure to add your name to the wait list and be ready to jump in right when doors open. You'll also receive an exclusive discount code too to be able to join us. This program is truly life-changing, but it also is so much fun to be able to connect with other women. You have our support, myself, Ramona, our other functional medicine registered dietitian, to ask any questions throughout the entirety of the program. And there's so many fun resources that we give you too, to be able to make this just so exciting and fun and truly transformative for you. So we hope to see you guys inside. And I hope that you start to think about, even if you don't decide to join us, I hope you start to think about the role that inflammation could be having in your hormones. I hope you guys have a great rest of your day, and we'll see you back next week for another episode.